Welcome to your personalized deep dive. You ready? Because today we're tackling a topic that you can't ignore, the link between conflict and hunger.
That's right, and we're diving deep into a recent report from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations and the World Food Program.
This report is like an X-ray, really revealing the stark reality of global food crises, especially where conflict is, the main driver.
Exactly, and what's striking is that it goes beyond just the immediate lack of food, It exposes how conflict just tears apart every single aspect of food systems and leaves a lasting impact.
Okay, so let's unpack this. I've taken a look at the report, and one thing that immediately jumps out are the numbers. Millions upon millions of people facing acute food insecurity.
You've probably seen the headlines, but this report really brings it home, this idea that acute food insecurity is just exploding and conflict is fanning the flames. This isn't just about empty stomachs today, it's about entire generations.
Absolutely. This is not a temporary crisis. It's a long-term catastrophe in the making. The report states that in late 2020, over 21 million people were experiencing emergency levels of acute food insecurity. That's like, try to imagine everyone in a city the size of London facing life-threatening hunger.
It's a staggering statistic, and tragically, projections for 2021 showed those numbers skyrocketing even further. And what's even more alarming is this represents a near 20% surge from the same period in 2019. This isn't just a steady increase, this is a crisis escalating at an alarming rate.
It's terrifying. It feels like a runaway train, gathering momentum as it goes. Conflict erupts and the aftershocks just ripple outwards, dragging more and more people into desperate situations.
And sadly, the report identifies certain countries that are really teetering on the brink. Afghanistan, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Palestine, South Sudan, Yemen. These places are grappling with incredibly high percentages of their populations facing acute hunger.
It's easy to get lost in the numbers. But behind every statistic is a human life, a family struggling to survive. The report really emphasizes that these aren't just headlines. These are real people facing unimaginable hardship.
And it's important to understand that conflict doesn't just disrupt food production, it dismantles entire food systems. The report dives into 3 specific ways this happens, and it's really eye-opening.
The first one is mass displacement, which, when you think about it, it makes sense, right? Conflict forces people from their homes, their land, their entire way of life. It's like uprooting a tree and expecting it to flourish in a completely different environment.
Exactly. This mass movement of people disrupts everything, including their access to food. They're cut off from their traditional sources of sustenance, thrust into unfamiliar territories, and forced to rely on aid that may or may not be available.
It's a recipe for disaster. And then the report goes on to talk about the deliberate targeting of food systems, which is just horrifying to even think about.
This is where it gets really interesting and deeply disturbing. Conflict isn't just about battles. It's about leveraging food as a weapon. It's about intentionally destroying farms, livestock, food storage facilities, transportation routes.
We're not just talking about collateral damage here. We're talking about calculated tactics designed to starve entire populations into submission. It's a chilling thought, and it's something the report really wants to drive home.
It's a tactic as old as conflict itself, but it's often overlooked amidst the chaos of war. This report brings it to the forefront, highlighting how conflict manipulates food as a tool of control and oppression.
And to make matters even worse, the report details how conflict creates a perfect storm that prevents humanitarian aid from reaching those who need it most.
Absolutely. Just when help is most critical, conflict throws up every obstacle imaginable. Transportation becomes dangerous, access is denied, and a dire situation just spirals into a catastrophe.
The report highlights 3 countries in particular, where this intersection of conflict and hunger is especially alarming: Burkina Faso, northern Nigeria, and South Sudan. What's happening in these countries is like a microcosm of the larger problem.
That's right. Burkina Faso, for example, has seen a staggering increase in the number of people facing crisis levels of food insecurity, a 66% jump between late 2019 and late 2020.
That's a heartbreaking number, and it's important to remember that's not just a statistic. It represents real people, families, entire communities being pushed to the brink.
And a large part of this surge is directly linked to the violence and displacement that have plagued the region. Millions of people, many of whom were already vulnerable, have been thrust further into crisis.
It's like a tidal wave of suffering, and it's difficult to even comprehend the scale of the devastation. The report then shifts its focus to northern Nigeria, where a similar story is unfolding. Years of conflict, particularly the Boko Haram insurgency, have just torn the region apart.
It's heartbreaking. The insurgency has displaced millions, devastated farmlands, and left a trail of destruction in its wake. And the result? Millions facing acute food insecurity and a future that's really shrouded in uncertainty.
And as if the situation wasn't dire enough, the report highlights how humanitarian aid is constantly under threat, making it incredibly difficult to reach those most in need. It's a heartbreaking cycle of violence and deprivation with no easy solution.
Precisely. And this same cycle of conflict and hunger is on full display in South Sudan as well?
South Sudan has been ravaged by conflict for years, and the scars run deep. The report paints a grim picture of the country's shattered food systems with this widespread destruction of crops, livestock, and even vital water treatment facilities.
It's a calculated assault on the very things that sustain life, and the consequences are nothing short of catastrophic. Millions are facing crisis levels of food insecurity, and the projections suggest that the situation is likely to worsen. It's a truly desperate situation.
It's hard to fathom the level of desperation in these situations, but the report does a remarkable job of bringing these struggles to life by sharing some personal stories of those caught in the crossfire.
One story that stood out to me was about a group of farmers in Burkina Faso who were forced to abandon their land due to escalating violence. Their only option was to flee to survive, leaving behind their only means of feeding their families. It's a heartbreaking choice, but one that many are forced to make.
It's like being stranded at sea with a life preserver just out of reach. The report then shares another harrowing account from Nigeria, where more than 100 agricultural workers were brutally murdered by Boko Haram while harvesting rice.
These workers were simply trying to provide food for their communities, and they were targeted in cold blood. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and how it can manifest in the most brutal ways imaginable.
These stories are incredibly difficult to hear, but they highlight the very real and personal impact of this global crisis. And in South Sudan, the situation takes another devastating turn.
The report cites the deliberate destruction of water treatment facilities, depriving communities not only of food but also of safe drinking water. It's a recipe for absolute disaster and a clear violation of international law.
It's a blatant disregard for human life, and sadly, this kind of tactic is being employed in conflict zones around the world. It's a sobering reminder of the challenges we face, but the report doesn't leave us without a glimmer of hope.
You're right, it's not all doom and gloom. The report emphasizes that while conflict can lead to devastating hunger, it's not an insurmountable challenge. There are things we can do, both individually and collectively, to address this crisis.
That's what I wanted to get into next. The report does a fantastic job of laying out the problem, but it also offers some potential solutions. Let's take a closer look at what those might look like in part 2 of this deep dive.
The report, really emphasizes that conflict doesn't just destroy resources, it actually weaponizes them. Like denying access to food and water, it becomes a tactic of war, a way to, exert control and punish communities.
It's utterly inhumane. And the worst part is, as the report makes clear, these tactics are often incredibly effective. But Burkina Faso, Nigeria, South Sudan, these aren't isolated cases, are they?
Not at all. The report uses them as these focal points, but it underscores that these situations are playing out in various forms across multiple conflict zones. Think about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where over 20 million people are facing those crisis levels of food insecurity, fueled by both conflict and political instability.
Right, and it feels like in those situations, even when there is a will to help, getting aid into those areas is just like navigating a minefield. Literally and figuratively.
Exactly. The report paints a pretty chilling picture of aid convoys coming under attack, food supplies being looted, aid workers facing these constant threats. It's a stark reminder of the incredible risks that these individuals take to deliver life-saving assistance.
It's truly heroic. And it highlights the complexity of these situations, Yeah. You're not just dealing with a lack of food, you're dealing with violence, political instability, and a whole host of other factors that can make addressing hunger, honestly, feel like an insurmountable task. But this report isn't just about despair, right? There's a call to action woven throughout.
Absolutely. The report makes a powerful argument that we can't simply respond to these crises, as they appear on our radar. We need to shift our focus from reaction to prevention.
So getting ahead of the curve.
Precisely. And that requires tackling the root causes of conflict itself, which is a monumental task, to be sure. But the report argues that investing in peace-building efforts, strengthening governance structures, and addressing issues like inequality are essential steps towards breaking the cycle of conflict and hunger.
It's about creating the conditions where these crises are less likely to ignite in the first place, right? Fostering a more stable and equitable world.
Exactly, and the report really underscores the need for greater investment in what are called conflict-sensitive development approaches. Essentially, these are programs that not only address the immediate needs like food and water, but also work to build resilience within communities and reduce the risk of future conflicts.
So it's not enough to just put out the fire. We need to figure out how to prevent it from starting in the first place.
Yeah.
It's a long-term strategy for lasting change.
Exactly. And achieving that requires a much more holistic and integrated approach, one that brings together humanitarian organizations, development actors, governments, local communities.
It's about collaboration, shared responsibility, and a long-term commitment to creating a world where conflict doesn't automatically equate to empty stomachs.
And where every human being has that fundamental right to live a life free from hunger. This report serves as a powerful reminder that these issues are interconnected and really demand a global response.
It's a call to action that echoes far beyond the pages of this report. It's a call to examine our own roles, even from afar, in creating a more just and equitable world.
Precisely, because ultimately, addressing conflict and hunger isn't just about sending food aid, It's about addressing the underlying power imbalances, the systemic inequalities, those historical injustices that fuel these crises in the first place.
It's about understanding that these issues are interconnected, that we can't just tackle them in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So as we kind of reach the end of this deep dive, what's the one takeaway you hope our listener walks away with?
That awareness is that first step. This report shines a light on a really harsh reality, but it also illuminates a path forward. By understanding the intricate link between conflict and hunger, by recognizing the human cost of inaction, we empower ourselves to become agents of change.
It's about realizing that we're not powerless. In the face of these immense challenges, we can make a difference.
Exactly. Even small acts of solidarity, of raising awareness, of supporting organizations working on the front lines, it all has a ripple effect. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and taking action.
Because every voice raised against injustice, every act of kindness, every effort to build a more peaceful and equitable world, it brings us one step closer to ending hunger. This report has been a lot to process, but it's also been incredibly eye-opening.
It's a powerful reminder of the interconnectedness of our world. What happens in seemingly distant countries can have far-reaching consequences, and we have a responsibility to be informed and engaged global citizens.
This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. So as we wrap things up, I'm curious to know, what stood out to you most from all of this?
The sheer scale of the issue is hard to ignore, but what really resonated with me was the report's emphasis on solutions. It doesn't just highlight the problems, it offers a roadmap for a more just and food-secure future.
It's a call to action, both for policymakers and for individuals. So to our listener out there, what will you do with this knowledge? What resonated most with you?
The power to make a difference starts with awareness. What will you choose to do with that awareness?
That's something I hope you'll ponder long after this deep dive is over. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged in the fight against hunger.